So the next function that you have on your camera to control the image exposure is the shutter speed. And basically the shutter speed is the overall time that each frame is exposed for. Okay, so you can have 100th of a second, 200th of a second, 300. So the next function that you have on your camera to control the image exposure is the shutter speed. And basically the shutter speed is the overall time that each frame is exposed for. Okay, so you can have 100th of a second, 200th of a second, 300, 400, and so on. So that's saying that you're letting in a certain amount of light only for that certain amount of time. So your aperture is controlling how much light is going into the camera, and your shutter speed is controlling how fast that shutter is opening and closing. And this story or an example that I heard that I'll never forget is, imagine that you have barn doors on a farm, right? Or on a farmhouse, whatever, on a dairy, on a farm somewhere where there's cows. And the barn doors that open, imagine that is the aperture of the camera. So if you have wide open the barn doors, you're gonna let a large amount of cows, let's say the cows are the light photons that are entering the sensor through the camera, a wide barn doors or a wide aperture is going to let in more light photon cows into the barn. Now imagine the shutter speed is the speed at which the barn doors open and close. So if you have a slow shutter speed, you're going to be able to let a lot of cows into that barn. But if you have a fast shutter speed, like 100th or 200th of a second, there's not many cows that are going to get into that barn. So each shutter speed has its own effect, and each f-stop has its own effect too. So the higher the shutter speed, the less the dragging or the blurring there is on each exposed frame. So let's say you have a slower shutter speed. The slower the shutter speed, the more motion blur that there's going to be. The softer the image is going to be too. Generally, in cinematic film, film that you see in the movie theater, the shutter speed is double the frame rate. The reason is that this creates a more natural kind of blur that mimics the blur that the eye experiences. So it's easier to look at, it's more pleasing to the eye. So if you're shooting at 24 frames a second, the kind of standard for a natural film look would be a 50th of a second for the shutter speed. Now, if you want to move away from that natural look and get more of that kind of HD, high definition, possibly action sports stuff, you use a higher shutter speed because there's going to be less blurry. So in more of like Bourne Identity, definitely Saving Private Ryan has an amazing example in that rain sequence where you can really, really feel that strobiness and that kind of war-like, ultra-realistic feel. Now, if they would have went with a slower shutter speed, it would have had a totally different effect on the audience. It would have been that much more cinematic, calming, but having that high shutter speed creates just that kind of ultra high definition look and feel, which can work for your film or can work against your film. So knowing how you want to affect your audience is going to help you decide on that. So with that said, if you're looking for that cinematic look and feel, you're going to want your shutter speed to double your frame rate. If you're shooting at 24 frames a second, you're going to want to have your shutter speed at a 50th of a second. If you're shooting action or you're shooting something that you want to look ultra realistic where you can see all the definition and it doesn't have that motion blur, each frame is a clean image, you're going to want to bump up the shutter speed to much, much higher. So now you guys are almost camera setting experts. Next up, what we're going to be talking about is aperture. It's a very important fundamental understanding of how to get the most out of your, camera video settings. So aperture, simply put, is, the f-stop number. The lower the f-stop number, right now I'm shooting at 2.8, the wider the lens opening and the more amount of light is getting into the camera. The higher the number, the exact opposite. The less light, the less depth of field. So let's explain what that means. So the higher the f-stop, the smaller opening and the less depth of field. This is great when you want to make everything in focus, like for landscape shot, action shots where there's a lot of movement or a lot of things in the image you want to have in focus, and really wide angle shots. The lower the f-stop, the lower the aperture, this has more depth of field. This is great for when you want what is in focus to be sharp and what is closer and further to be out of focus. This has a more cinematic look and feel. This is great for controlled situations, shots when you're, talking to the camera or you're shooting someone that's talking to the camera, because it blurs out the background and makes the image look more professional. So let me ask you here, which out of these two images has a low f-stop or aperture and a high f-stop or aperture? Image number 1 with this leaf, and image number 2 with this open landscape. So would you guess that image number 1 with the leaf is a wide aperture with a shallow depth of field, or a narrow depth of field with a high aperture? Okay, perfect. Yes. This is shot at f2. The aperture is wide open, so the leaf is in focus. What's behind it is blurred. This gives a really great look and style, so we want to keep this in mind when we're going into our own projects. Do we want to have, that everything is in focus look that's more action oriented? Are we shooting like some parkour video where someone's doing backflips off a bridge? Maybe, maybe not. So this image on the right, if you had to guess the f-stop, what would you guess? Would it be an f4, f5, f10, f15? It's got to be up there pretty high. So let's see. f22. That's why the rocks that are only a few feet away from the camera are just as in focus as that mountain that's hundreds of feet away from the camera. So hopefully that gives you an idea of when to use a wide aperture and when to use a high or low aperture. Right now, I'm shooting at f2.0, which is a relatively low aperture because I know I want to be in focus and I want the background to be blurry, right? I'm not shooting this really cool mountain landscape, so I'm not at f22. Plus, I'm not out in a really bright scenario with broad daylight. You're going to need a really high aperture, and that's going to give you a properly exposed image. Next up is the focal length, or the angle of view that lets in light into the camera, okay? The millimeter, the mm on your lens equals the millimeter, and the shorter that mm number is, the shorter the focal length, or the wider the angle of view. A 22 millimeter is a really relatively wide angle of view, while a 200 millimeter, which is a much higher number, is a much more narrow field of view, or a much more telephoto type lens. Wider is for more action oriented, a fun and playful feel. Generally, YouTube videos are shot on a much wider. Right now we're shooting at about 22, 24. This gives a wider feel. If it's something that's more documentary style, or something where you're shooting something off in a distance, you're going to want to use a telephoto lens so you can get a much more zoomed in look and a shallower depth of field. So the overall wider is more desirable for YouTube and Instagram style, while a telephoto is like, shooting things like wedding style, or more of a documentary style, or more of something where you want to have a more professional look, okay? The wider the angle, the less depth of field, the more everything's in focus. The shallower or the higher the focal length, the shallower the field of view. Also, the shallower the depth of field. What's in focus is clear, what's out of focus is very blurry. So let me ask, let's get back to this leaf and mountain image here. Which angle here is a wide angle and which one is a telephoto? Is the leaf wide or telephoto? Okay. Now, if you're guessing that, what would you guess would be the millimeter of this shot of the leaf? Would it be a 20 millimeter, 50 millimeter, 100, 150, 200? Let's see. Okay, so this is a 200 millimeter lens. You can tell that the camera is probably, 6 to 8 or 9 feet away from that leaf, but it's zoomed in and creating a very crisp image with a soft background. Now, if we look at this mountain image,
Would you put this as a 10 millimeter, 30 millimeter, 40, 50, 80 millimeter? It's probably going to be on the much lower end because it's a pretty wide angle. So let's see. Yep, that's a 20 millimeter. That's why we can see such a wide field of view in this landscape. So hopefully that's making sense. You're able to kind of compile this together. Of course, I'm going to be demonstrating this later in the course. This is getting us to the point where we're all speaking the same language. So now that you really understand the fundamentals of your video settings for your camera and for your phone, it's time to apply all this information we just learned. So it's your turn. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a learning exercise on shooting one shot in two different ways. Okay? What we're going to do is choose one subject or object or scene or whatever you want to shoot, and we're going to shoot it two different ways. Okay? The first way is going to be on auto settings or improper settings, okay? The information before what you learned in this course so far, okay? So overexposed, the ISO is all wrong, the shutter speed is all wrong, or the aperture is not really ideal for what you're shooting. And then you're going to shoot it a second way, which is going to be the upgraded way with what the information that you learned so far. So what I want you to really do is apply yourself on this learning exercise and use the proper ISO, shutter speed, picture profile, white balance, aperture, and focal length. You guys are more than welcome to do either a video of you talking or a photo of an object that's at your house or outdoors, really whatever you want, something to get creative with. And you're going to export that video link or screenshot with the standard shot first and then the upgraded shot to the course Q&A and share your before and after of not using what you've learned or maybe the way you would have shot it before, and then using these techniques to shoot something in a much more aesthetically pleasing way. So I'm going to cut to me doing this too right now along with you guys at my own house. I'm going to choose something to shoot. I'm going to shoot it the improper way, and then I'm going to shoot a second much better image. So the first thing I'm going to do is with my smartphone, I'm going to find something at my house and I'm going to shoot it with like improper settings, and I'm going to do a screen capture so you guys can see exactly what I'm doing, and then I'm going to shoot it with the proper settings and show you the before and after. So let's see what we can find. All right, so we have our first image here on my smartphone, and we can see our shutter speed is at 24 frames per second. Our white balance is at tungsten, so there's kind of this weird purplish hue to it. And so our auto white balance is set to the improper setting for this type of environment. And our ISO is pretty high for this kind of scenario. So what I'm going to do first is start with the shutter speed, and I'm going to go to 50th. And then I'm going to move to our white balance here, and I'm going to go to manual. And now I'm going to go and I'm going to set this. See, that's a little too blue. The Kelvin rating is too low. I'm going to go at about 3500 here. I'm going to tap on where we want to focus. And I'm going to check the ISO here. Bring the ISO down just a little bit. Perfect. And so here's my before, and here's my after shot. All right, for this next example, we have this painting here, and now I'm shooting on my DSLR. So let's see if we first start with focusing on the focal length aspect of our settings. If I zoom in here and change the focal length, we see a little bit of change in the overall depth of field and the overall stylizing of, really picking up on the depth and the texture of this image. So if we zoom back out, we're at 24 frames. Let's get our settings right. Let's first start by opening up our aperture from a 9.0 to a 2.8. This is going to give us a much more shallow and stylized depth of field. Now we're going to drop our ISO to something about, let's say 1250. Let's say 1250. And we can now see that we're getting a little bit more of a shallow depth of field. We can see that this painting in the foreground is in focus, while this one in the back is out of focus. And now we can come back to this one being in focus. And to accentuate this look even more, we can change our focal length from a 24 millimeter to something like a 70 millimeter, so that now we really have this cooler style depth of field, right? Where we can really focus in on the depth of this image. This really kind of more textured image compared to this much more flat image of the same exact object is an example of using our different settings to really try and create a better looking and stylized image of what we're shooting. Alrighty, so for this example, welcome to my kitchen. This is where the magic happens. Let's see what we got in here. I'm gonna grab this, some turmeric. I'm gonna set it right down here.
And so if we focus, we have the camera was just automatically set to the aperture at 11, the shutter speed at a 50th, and the ISO at 1250. So let's see here, since we're shooting at a DSLR, let's focus on aperture for this example. Let's get the exposure right. And then I'm going to take a photo of this example. Okay. And then now I'm going to get the same proper exposure with different settings. So what I'm going to do is bring down the aperture so we have a much wider depth of field. And then I'm going to bring down the ISO so that we're not getting overexposed, and then our image is actually going to be a lot less grainy. And then I'm going to set the focus. I can even go down further on the aperture. And now I'm going to take the same exact photo. And you can see how that simple difference of changing the aperture, even if you're getting the same exposure value, that simple change in settings makes a much more dramatic and stylized image. So let's see the before and afters of these examples. Now I'm excited to see what kind of examples that you upload that are your before and after examples in the student Q&A section. I'll see you in the next lecture.
All right, so mastering your lenses, an incredibly, incredibly important tool to becoming an incredible, incredible video creator. Why is this? Because the lenses that you choose affect the viewer greatly. The way the viewer feels about the film, the way your film looks, and the overall aesthetic is so intertwined with the lenses that you choose. So let's break down the different functions of each lens. So the very first thing is focus, which we already talked about briefly. You use the focusing ring on the camera unless you're using auto mode. Generally, we're going to be using manual focus mode. And what you're doing is you're telling the camera or the lens what to focus on according to its distance from the lens itself. The next element of a lens is the image stabilization. Some lenses have this, some lenses don't. But if your lens has it, I suggest you turn it on. It's basically just a little element in the back of the lens that acts kind of like a gyro, counteracting movement, hand shaking, just kind of smoothing out the overall look and taking out tiny vibrations. It can't do a whole lot, but it does definitely make a little bit of a difference when you're shooting handheld and you got some shaky hands. So the next is the aperture, which we spoke on. It affects how much lens, how much light, how many cows are entering your lens. The next is the focal length of the lens. The focal length is the millimeters that is in the name of what the lens actually is. So a 24 to 70 millimeter, that's the focal length of that lens. So the lower the number of the focal length, the millimeter, the wider the lens is, right? You know, like GoPros, super wide angle lens, fisheye, these are generally 8 millimeter. I'm shooting right now on a 24 millimeter. That's the focal length, the width or the narrowness that the lens captures. Depending on what kind of lens you have, each lens has a focal length. There are prime lenses and there are zoom lenses as well. A zoom lens has a variable focal length, okay? So a 24 to 70 is a zoom lens because you can set the focal length at multiple different millimeters. A prime lens, on the other hand, has a fixed focal length, which we'll talk about a little bit more, what the pros and the cons are for each lens, whether it be a prime or a zoom. The next element of each lens that is really important is the clarity. Not only does the glass that you have in your lens affect the focal length, right? It also affects the image clarity. So the cheaper glass that you buy, the lower the clarity of the lens is. So if you buy a 50 millimeter 1.8, this is a lower, let's say you buy a Canon brand 50 millimeter 1.8. There's the Canon 50 millimeter 1.8, 1.4, and 1.2, right? There's not that big of a difference in the maximum aperture, but really what you're paying for is the quality of the glass. So that's something to really bear in mind here, that you can go out and you can purchase these, you know, kit lenses that they have, or it's like a 70 to 200 and it's only like $200. You're gonna get what you pay for, okay? You have to start somewhere, so that's something to keep in mind, that I started with, you know, pretty crappy glass, and you slowly work your way up, and the higher quality the glass is, the more professional and the more clear and the more clarity that your image will have. So the difference between a 1.8 and 1.4 and a 1.2, all 50 millimeters, there's just slightly a wider aperture, but really the glass is going to make a huge difference on the overall aesthetic of the lens. So the next thing before we get into the actual lenses themselves is more of a deeper understanding of depth of field, right? We kind of touched on this a little bit, but I really want to explain to you guys how to use this as a tool to not only guide the eye of your audience, but to create more pleasing and cinematic videos, or just a better video overall, is using depth of field as a strong tool and an asset. The lower the f-stop is on the camera, the lower the number is of the aperture, the wider the aperture is. Let's say a 50 millimeter 1.2 is going to have a very, very shallow depth of field. So whatever's in front of the camera, if you're focused at what's 3 feet away from the lens, at a shallow depth of field, there's going to be a razor thin kind of plane of what goes in and out of focus. So right here at 3 feet will be in focus. Just in front of that will be out of focus. Just behind that will be out of focus. This is excellent for creating depth and guiding the eye of the audience. The background behind me right now is out of focus because I'm using a 2.8, a 24 to 70 at 2.8 to keep me in focus and the background out of focus, which guides the viewer's eye to me. There's no distractions. The other thing that I use, which we'll talk about when we get to lighting, is that I'm well exposed, but the background is much darker than I am and much more out of focus. So see, as a cinematographer, we're actively guiding the audience's eye to where we want to guide them. So on the other hand, if we want to have a wide depth of field and we don't want to guide the audience's eye and we want everything to be in focus in the image, maybe we're shooting landscape or a wide shot, or really want to capture the entire environment on a wide angle lens of a certain scenario, we would have a wide depth of field by bringing that f-stop up to 8.0, 9.0, 10.0, a number higher, much higher than its maximum f-stop, so that the whole image, the whole depth of the distance away from the lens itself is more into focus. Another reason we would want to use this is maybe we're shooting a subject with a lot of movement. We don't necessarily know how far or how close the objects of interest that we want to be in focus are going to come to and from the lens, right? Like the ducks that you saw earlier. If we wanted all those ducks to be in focus, we would bump up that f-stop to a much higher number. Because on that shallow depth of field, there's just a razor thin field of view that stays in focus. So that's used for much more cinematic controlled situations when you want to guide the viewer's eye. And then a wider depth of field is when you want to have everything in focus so that you can see the whole environment as it is and let the viewer do what they want. So with that deeper understanding, we can see now that the audience is never going to pay attention to a badly exposed part of the frame, right? They're not going to pay attention to the dark parts of the frame. They're not going to pay attention to the bright, overexposed parts of the frame. Their eye is going to be guided to the most pleasing part of the frame. And they're not going to look at the blurry part of the frame, right? This is how you create more effective video, is by knowing what you're doing with these tools. So we always want to be guiding the viewer's eye by using proper exposure and proper focusing. Because if the background was in focus and I was out of focus, even though I'm talking right to you, you would be paying attention. Oh, what's back there? What is that thing that you're trying to see that's in focus? So actively, obviously, in this situation, it's obvious that I would want to be in focus. But in other situations where you're doing things more subtle, that's not just a talking head interview, and you want the audience to say, hey, look at this. This is of importance. You're going to want to use a shallow depth of field and the proper exposure to guide the audience to follow what you're trying to tell them, right? Because you're like feeding them the story bit by bit with all the imagery that you're choosing. And you bring that all together to create the actual story and the actual purpose and the cinematography of your video. So with that said, each lens, like I mentioned before, has its own unique aesthetic and feeling that the viewer is subconsciously feeling or consciously feeling, because the lens itself is warping the light and the space around it to create a specific quality. So that basically boils down to wide angle, medium, telephoto, and macro lenses. Each one of these lenses has a specific and unique effect. So let's get into it.